Are the 2024 Royals a team to copy for some small market clubs going into 2025? We'll talk about it in this edition of Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are tuned into another edition of Locked On Royals in the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And you can also catch us on wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast. We're on Odyssey and YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. If you're a first-time listener and you want to know a little bit more about me and this show, I am based here in Kansas City. I work at Sports Radio 810 WHB, doing some hosting, co-hosting, and a little bit of producing as well. But when it comes to this podcast, when you click on this link, you know that you're going to be getting 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. Well, this will be our final episode of the week. I've been saying that now for the last couple of episodes. Still have an ongoing personal family issue, so not going to have time to do an episode tomorrow. But if you did tune in yesterday or on Tuesday, I made it known that I'll put out the tweet. You can also send me your questions on YouTube, and I will try to have them all answered by the end of the weekend. So no Mailbag Friday episode tomorrow, but we will be doing kind of our own Mailbag Friday where I'll just directly answer it to you. If you want to just respond to the tweet, that's totally fine. If you want to leave the comments on YouTube, totally fine as well. And if you want to just direct message me, I will be sure to get your answers on whatever you may be thinking about when it comes to the Royals, as next week will be the winter meetings. We're also going to have a very special interview coming up on Tuesday, I believe is when I have it planned. So it'll be a usual 5-episode week next week, barring any random changes there. And then one last reminder that in 10 days now, December 15th, we'll be dropping down to 3 episodes a week, as we do every single off season. Just give about 2 months of a layoff a little bit for some of the baseball podcasters. So we won't be doing 5 episodes a week, but we will be doing 3 episodes a week. And I can always guarantee one of those episodes will be a Mailbag Friday, just so we can dedicate one of the episodes of the week to the listeners. But for our first segment today, I thought it was a good time to kind of go over what happened today, which will be our second segment talk, and tie it into one of our other segments, which today, the big news was that Luis Severino signed the most expensive deal in Oakland A's history. Now we have to call them the Athletics because they're going to be playing in Sacramento, and I don't think they're going to be known as the Sacramento A's. So the A's, the biggest contract in their franchise's existence, a $67 million deal over 3 years, $22 million, or at least a little over $22 million a year. And Luis Severino, one of the top pitchers on the market, not in the elite bunch where we saw Blake Snell be in, and certainly Hiroki Sasaki is going to go, but Luis Severino is a fine number 1 to number 2, number 3 starter for some of the teams out there. He was great this year for the Mets. Not an elite arm, but certainly a serviceable arm for a Mets team that went pretty deep into the postseason. So the A's, they got their number 1 guy. That's a non-negotiable, and we'll talk about how good that is for baseball in 2025. But for this first segment, I think it's important to note that what the Royals did last year, I think sparked a lot of other small market clubs going into this year. And we'll probably know more about some of those small market clubs next week during the winter meetings. But I feel like last year, a lot of the small market teams that were notorious for not spending used the Royals as a guinea pig. And I'm not trying to use that as a slight towards Kansas City. You know I wouldn't do that. But I think some of the teams out there that have always been able to fall back on, hey, we're not going to spend until we're ready, they were using the Royals as an example. And the Royals realized after their 106 loss season and the draft lottery system was not going to reward bad seasons anymore, it was time to spend money. Because if you're going to get support from the fan base, if you're going to better your attendance numbers, if you're going to get a great new TV deal, you need to field a competitive team. Because if you don't spend money, bring in big free agents, they don't need to be the Juan Sotos or the Shohei Otanis of the world, but you can spend money. And the Royals going out there and signing Seth Lugo, Michael Wacha, giving Bobby Witt Jr. a long-term extension, signing multiple guys to the bullpen, signing guys like Hunter Renfroe, Adam Frazier, Garrett Hampson. Those weren't earth-shattering moves, but it showed that the Royals were continuously trying to build up a team that they felt would be good enough to compete in the postseason. And they were correct on that. And the fact it worked out in the way that it did, I think it's now sparked a lot of other small market teams saying, hey, if they did it and they were coming off the second worst record in all of baseball, why can't we do it? I do think the little caveat here, the asterisk you need to put next to it, is that the Royals also had a superstar and Bobby Witt Jr. I mean, that can't go unnoticed, right? Oakland, as much as I do love some of their younger pieces, the Lawrence Butlers, the JJ Bidays, you also have Mason Miller out of the back end of the bullpen, and then Brent Rooker, a multiple-time All-Star. Just a one-time All-Star. I think he got snubbed this past year, but 2 incredible years in Oakland. We'll call it at that. So Oakland doesn't have that centerpiece to build around, but we'll get into this in the second segment about why it's so good for baseball and why more small market teams should have the pressure turned up on them a little bit. Because I think a problem in baseball certainly is the no salary cap, right? So you can have teams like the Yankees and Dodgers just continuously sign big name guys and they can defer the money and it's not going to be too much of an issue. And I've always been frustrated with that, but also frustrated with small market owners saying, well, that's just unfair. Because some of the payrolls we saw in baseball, most notably with the Athletics, that's just not a competitive payroll. We all know at this point in time, in modern day baseball, you have to spend to compete. You can build a small payroll team and get to the postseason. We saw the Rays do it. We saw the Moneyball A's do it. We saw Cleveland win a division with a very small payroll. But we also saw this year and last year, teams that spent money won the World Series. And I think the Royals allowed other small market teams to have this blueprint, if you will, to say, we like a few pieces, and we may not be coming off a great year. In the past, it was all about, hey, we were on the cusp of the postseason. Now we can spend. You don't need to do that anymore. You can try to field a competitive bunch and go year by year. You don't need to look 4 to 5 years down the road and circle when you think you're going to be competitive. That didn't work out for the Royals in their rebuild going from 2018 to 2013. They circled multiple years about when they would be competitive. It never came. And eventually, John Sherman and J.J. Picollo said, we got to spend because we got to bring the fan base back into it. We got to make Kansas City an intriguing destination. And now I would say that it is. It's one of the more intriguing destinations for small market teams because free agents will look at the rotation they had. They will look at the coaching staff they had. Bobby Witt Jr., how gorgeous Kauffman Stadium is. They were a playoff team a year ago. That goes, a long ways with a lot of guys out there. And, you have somebody like a Michael Wacha, for example, which, by the way, that Michael Wacha extension looks better and better by the day, considering what Luis Severino just got. But now, you have somebody like Michael Wacha who got the deal with Kansas City, and then Kansas City rewarded him with another extension, right? And we think that all the time that baseball players are just, guys on the field. They're athletes, right? And we kind of disassociate with the human part of them, right? We boo guys, we cheer guys, we think that every time they're up in a big moment, they should be able to perform because we're paying them lots of money. At the end of the day, they're human beings. And a part of that is guys that have families, they're married, they've moved to a new city for the first time, they want to be embraced. It doesn't always happen. But that goes a long way with free agents and guys that may talk to impending free agents. And with Michael Wacha, right, he comes to Kansas City. The Royals give him that nice deal last offseason. He pitches well. Kansas City welcomes him with open arms. And then when he pitches well, the Royals give him a 3-year deal. Don't even let him hit free agency. And you keep him and his family happy. That goes a long way in baseball. Because what can happen is, Michael Wacha talks to former teammates, or he talks to other guys that he may know about, hey, I'm really happy here in Kansas City. They treat you right here. It's a good group here in the clubhouse. It's a good coaching staff, passionate fan base. They treat us well here. And that is very important to attract other free agents. If you are a team that has a star player and they play out their rookie deal and then you never extend them, that reflects poorly on you, because then you may be a young player that, wants to make a home here, feels like you're building a relationship with the fan base, and then ownership never gives you the deal. That's happened, and that's happened before in Kansas City, of just letting certain guys walk, Carlos Beltran being one of them, right? The Royals have had stars before not get that deal. Bobby Witt Jr. got it. He's a star player that a lot of players want to go play with. But having that sort of mentality of, we're going to give you a nice deal, we're going to treat you well, it's a good clubhouse, there's no, locker room or clubhouse cancers on the team. And it's also going to come down to the aggressiveness from a GM. How many times have we heard from former players that they were on a good team, they felt like they were playing well, and ownership in the front office just sold off all their players? Hey, we're not ready to compete right now. We need to sell off some talent. And that really frustrates certain players on a team. And I think pretty much every single organization has gone through it at some point in time. But for the Royals, they weren't playing their best ball leading up to the deadline. And JJ McCullough still made an effort to go out there and help this team, because he honored the commitment he gave to some of the free agents coming in of, we have a winner, we're going to do everything we can to help you guys out. And he stuck by that commitment. Towards September, when there were injuries, they bring in Tommy Pham, Robbie Grossman, Yuli Gurriel, continuously trying to help the Royals get to the postseason, to reward the guys that have worked so hard all season long. So now for some of these small market teams, you look at what the Royals did and said, why not us? There was nothing that indicated the Royals were ready to win. And they went from a bad 56-106 team, completely overhauled their rotation, and they had guys they built around offensively, changed up the bullpen a little bit, and they won 86 games in a playoff series. Like, if they can do it, we can do it. And I do think that's great for baseball. All right, we're going to take our first break of the show. When we come back, speaking of what's great for baseball, as we brought up, the A's gave a big-time deal, the most expensive one in their franchise's existence, to Luis Severino earlier this morning. I think it's fantastic for baseball, and I hope to see more of it going into next week. We'll dive into that next on Locked On Royals. You are tuning to Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Want to give a shout out to our one and only sponsor today in FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. For my pick, I'm going to go to a Sunday NFL game, Steelers and Browns. I think the Browns won't make it too straight against the Steelers and sweeping them for the season. So give me the Steelers money line with this game being in Pittsburgh. Continuing our topic of what's great for baseball, right? I thought the Royals last year were great for baseball, but more specifically small market teams, showing that, hey, if you invest a little bit of money, you can build a winner. You can build a competitive bunch. Maybe not a World Series team, but once you get into the Fall Classic, it's all random at that point. You catch fire at the right time, you might be able to make your way all the way to the World Series. This past year, it was more so of showcasing that spending a lot of money is going to get it done, because we got the Yankees and the Dodgers, though viewership was up in the World Series. But today, I would say that I was very pleased to see a team like the Athletics go out there and give Luis Severino the deal they gave him. I am not a big supporter over what ownership has done for the Athletics in the last couple of years, which is not much, not fielding competitive teams, not spending any money. And it's been that way for a long time. But also, moving out of the Bay Area and going and playing in a AAA stadium in Sacramento and then going to Vegas right after that. It felt like they just, blocked out the fans and never gave them a chance toward the end to support a winning baseball team. And we had seen A's teams do a lot with a little, right? They didn't have a very expensive payroll really ever. They never were great with attendance over the last couple of years. In fact, bottom of the league. But I don't blame a lot of the fan base being frustrated with ownership when you're talking about not just moving, but moving out of Oakland and then not spending any money on the team. Fielding teams that have a bunch of 4A guys and you're losing 100 plus games, 110 plus games. It was ugly. And then, of course, the first year where they're going to be out of Oakland, they give a guy like Luis Severino that type of deal. I mean, just with a snap of the finger, they give the most expensive deal in franchise history to Luis Severino. So I do hurt for Oakland fans that didn't get this type of support last year when they just as easily could have done it, given that type of money to somebody else. I think it was also reported that they were trying to give Sean Manaea, a former Oakland A and former Royals farmhand, a big-time deal, but they settled on Luis Severino. So I do feel for Oakland fans that it took till after they left to start making some splashes. And who knows? Maybe this is the one move they're going to hang their hat on and say, hey, we gave a big-time deal to a number one pitcher, at least a number one pitcher for our team, and we're good on that. We feel great about the rest of our team. Who really knows? John Fisher can be unpredictable. But I do say the good part about this, not so much of emphasizing that the A's decided to spend money after they left, but that this needs to be an offseason, I think, for the average baseball fan, where we got free agents and trade rumors really winding up on obscure teams, if you will. Maybe I didn't phrase that correctly the way I wanted to, because I'm not saying that I want really good players going to teams that aren't going to win any games, because I think that's unfair to the player. But I would like to see baseball even the playing field a little bit. If we're not going to have a salary cap, then I would like to see small market teams make more of an emphasis to make moves like the ones we saw today. Because as I brought up in the first segment, if the Athletics can give Luis Severino a $67 million deal over 3 years, nobody else in baseball can cry poor. Nobody else in baseball can say they can't make a deal like that. And there would be no excuse, to be honest. I think even last year, seeing what the Royals did, that canceled out the excuse of saying, hey, we're not ready to win. Because the Royals were not ready to win after 2023. They just assembled a brand new team and made a push, and that push worked out. There are good teams out there that refuse to spend. I have always been baffled with Cleveland's reluctance to spend money. Right? Cleveland, coming off a 90-plus win season, they got a lot of young talent. There were clearly holes in the rotation, but a fantastic team. I just don't have any confidence they're going to go out there and make a big splash. They are usually a team that, unlike what we saw with Jose Ramirez, who they did make a commitment to. I mean, they trade Francisco Lindor. They move on from Carlos Santana. They move on from Corey Kluber. And some of those moves did work out. They got Emmanuel Clase in the Corey Kluber deal. But in terms of free agency, spending money, being aggressive, it seems like they never did. It seems like they always sort of waited back, and when a player was at peak value, they did trade him and sometimes get good players in return. But I know a few Cleveland fans of my own that are very frustrated with the fact that ownership doesn't spend money. But if you're a team like the White Sox, for example, and I know some White Sox fans that are not thrilled whatsoever with Jerry Reisendorf and how the White Sox were operated last year and what they plan to do this year. The White Sox don't really have a core in place. They've got guys that they should be trading away to get young talent, but they still could field a more competitive bunch than a 120-loss team. Right? That's inexcusable, and that should never happen again in baseball. As much as Royals fans could poke fun at the White Sox, believe me, I had fun doing it a time or two. But if you want the sport to be watchable, if you want the sport to produce a lot more exciting games, a lot more exciting moments, putting more of an emphasis on the regular season, you can't be having multiple 100-loss teams and teams that are just never going to threaten to be competitive. Like, I look at a team like the Colorado Rockies, gorgeous stadium, gorgeous scenery. I am a frequent, frequent traveler to Colorado, whether it be to Copper Mountain or Breckenridge to snowboard. I've been to Steamboat before. I've been to Keystone Vale, a lot of those places to go and snowboard. I've been to Denver a lot, Colorado Springs, Boulder. Again, I go there all the time, and it's gorgeous. I'm a big mountain person. I love to go out there. And they've got a baseball team there that has just kind of refused over the last couple of years to be competitive or spend money. Now you could look at this A's deal and say, why not us? Why can't we go out there and spend some money on a guy that may be asking for $15 million a year or $18 million a year? You can do that, right? Because Oakland proved today that we can give a deal out like that. And that was always a point I was trying to argue for the Royals before this past off season, and just looking at the rest of baseball, going along with that argument that you can't cry poor when owners can absolutely put in money like this. You can invest into the team, and it may not result in you making it to the postseason. It may not result in you winning a World Series, but this should be about trying every single year. Every team, in my opinion, should go into the season feeling like they can make it to the postseason. If you're realistic with yourself, you may say, we don't have a World Series team, like on paper, but if we get our foot in the door, we can make a run. I think that's what the Royals did. I think they looked at the team on paper and said, if we are lucky enough to get our foot in the door in October, we can make a run. They fell a little bit short about that, but I don't think any Royals personnel, any player, any front office member thought last season was a failure. So for Oakland, maybe this is the only move they make, but they do have a couple of young players that I think grade out really well. They got a weak division this year. Maybe they could find themselves in late August with 75 wins. And you feel fortunate that you made a little bit of a push in free agency. You made a little bit of push in trying to make a trade. And I think fans are far more supportive of a team that falls short after trying to make moves than just not trying at all. And we just know in baseball, there will be numerous teams out there that do not make a single splash signing. They will chalk it up as they're not ready. We can't compete. Therefore, we'll just wait a couple extra years. We'll try to get a high pick in the lottery system. And who knows? You could lose 120 games and pick fifth. That's just the way the odds go. You might have the best chances to get the number one overall pick, but not having a locked-in number one pick anymore for having the worst record, it should incentivize teams to being more aggressive like we saw with the A's today. Luis Severino may not live up to that deal, but at least the A's are trying to make moves. Again, I'm not a supporter of John Fisher and how he owns the team, but if this is a sign of things to come, I'm for it because I think it's great for small market teams in Major League Baseball. Okay, we're going to take our final break of the show. When we come back, we have to lay to rest a Royals legend, somebody that I know for some of our listeners we're a big fan of. We'll pay tribute a little bit to close out our final episode of the week on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can find me on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. Well, our last story that we are going to wrap up our week with is a little bit of a somber one in laying to rest a Royals great in Al Fitzmorris. The news came out last night, sadly, and I thought when going over our schedule for today, what we were going to be talking about, I certainly wanted to squeeze it in. I just didn't know which segment it would be, and also how I wanted to do it. But I think a great way to go about this is for those out there that maybe listen to this podcast, they watch this podcast. If you've got a memory, because I do, one of my good buddies, former Royal Jamie Bluma, definitely had a relationship with Al Fitzmorris, said he was one of the kindest people out there. I saw some of the great tributes to Fitz. I think it was last night on Twitter, if I'm not mistaken, just stories of how nice he was, how generous he was, and how damn good of a player that he was, being the first Royal to hit from both sides of the plate. Believe in 1970, he had an OPS plus of 114, all on top of being an excellent pitcher, right? In 1974, had, I believe, the highest WAR, just a great year for him pitching in any way they needed him to, kind of being that swing man, right? We've been talking the last 2 weeks about the Royals trying to go after a swing man in free agency. Well, if there was somebody out there like Al Fitzmorris, it would be a home run type of deal. But I think it does show you a lot when it comes to athletes. It doesn't need to be just baseball. It can be football, basketball, hockey, soccer. When their time has come and when they pass on, I always love to hear the stories about really the person, not so much the player, because as I just told you right there, I listed off stats, right? I was too young to watch Al Fitzmorris play. I was only able to hear stories of Al Fitzmorris, but I think it tells you a lot about the person when the first story you hear is about them off the field. And I heard a chunk of stories, and good ones at that, about Al Fitzmorris off the field. And I think he goes down as one of those Royals names. I'm curious what some of the listeners out there think, but he's just one of those names you recognize from the old days. He goes in there with a Dennis Leonard, right? He goes in there with a Paul Splittorff, goes in there with a George Brett, a Steve Balboni, just listed Willie Wilson, right? He can go on and on and on. Or the Brian McRae, Hal McRae, Darryl Porter, Frank White, Brett Saberhagen. We could sit here the last 2 or 3 minutes and just go through guy after guy after guy. Mark Gubaza, like there are just, I think, names out there that if you are a certain age, you watched them play. You went to Kauffman Stadium and watched those guys play. And if you aren't of that era, if you aren't of those decades, you're like me, who their first introduction to Royals baseball was bad Royals teams, right? Maybe you grew up in the 70s, maybe you grew up in the 80s. You were introduced to more of a better ball club, a contending ball club, a championship ball club, and you might have envied that if you grew up in the 2000s or the late 90s or even the early 90s at that. But I will always say this, when you go to Kauffman Stadium or you're talking with Royals fans that are a little bit older, we're definitely around for the 70s and 80s, there's like names that come up, that it immediately registers. A bulb goes off in your head of, oh, I know that name. And as I was bringing up, of a chunk of those names, not all of them were great, right? Steve Balboni, the only reason I recognize him is for being on the 85 team. Had the killer mustache. He was a power hitter, and his home run record stood forever. But there are obviously more notable guys. Bo Jackson was somebody I didn't even mention right there. But Al Fitzmorris, to me, was one of those guys that the bulb went off. It registered with you about, you knew who that was. Even if you were 20 or 30 years removed, which myself is about 20 years removed from seeing Al Fitzmorris pitch for the Royals, which his final year was in 1976. I will age myself a little bit, but I wasn't born until 1999. So I didn't come close to seeing Al Fitzmorris not only play for the Royals, but play in general. But I think the beauty of baseball and why I've always loved it, there's this connection between younger generations and older generations, is that you don't need to see somebody play to appreciate the player, right? You listen to the stories of people talk about that guy, or even if they were retired, you hear the stories. The Buck O'Neil stories are phenomenal. And a lot of the people today have no recollection of Buck O'Neil managing or playing at all. But that doesn't mean you can't appreciate what he was able to do, right? I think baseball has this beautiful way of connecting everybody, whether they watch games in the 1940s and 50s to all the way till today, to 2024, 2025. And it's why it's America's pastime. There's these great stories and these great people that are involved in the sport. I think Al Fitzmorris is one of those people. And certainly today I was able to hear such great stories about him. And I'm curious for the listeners out there, if you've got a great story, a great memory, maybe watching him. I don't want to call out anybody that's never seen him before, but if there was something your dad or your grandpa told you, let us know in the YouTube comments or let us know in the Twitter comments, because definitely a sad day and having to lay to rest a guy like Al Fitzmorris, a Royals great. Hopefully there's some way they can honor him, and I'm sure they will going into the 2025 season in that first game, opening day at Kauffman Stadium against the Cleveland Guardians. Okay, that's going to do it for us this week. Another edition of Locked On Royals and the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. Thank you for making Locked On Royals your first listen today. For your second Find Locked On MLB as baseball guru Sully brings a daily blend of humor and baseball, keeping you updated on every rumor and story throughout the offseason. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Again, not going to have a Mailbag Friday tomorrow, at least an episode, but I'll be putting a tweet out there. Send me your questions on YouTube, send me your questions on Twitter, or you can direct message me on Twitter as well. I will be sure by the end of the week to answer every single one. But until next week, you take it easy, Kansas City.